Good evening. I want to make sure I wrote down my numbers on something. No pun intended. We're in the book of Numbers, but no, seriously, it was not intended to be a pun. But there's. How do I ask this question? Yeah, I don't know either. Do you find yourself that you get kind of invested in the people that you're reading about? Do you find that you look at their lives and you find yourself drawn to them? And when things begin to come to a close in a person's life, you begin to say, oh man, this is just, it's like saying goodbye, right? Well, that gets to be the deal with Moses here. Aaron's already gone. And so there are still some interesting intrigues in what you'll notice in this, because the book of Numbers ends with, Moses' departure, and he's told in advance about it like it was with Aaron. It's kind of the same situation. But when we get to Deuteronomy, the next book, we're still going to have, a lot of years of Moses' life. And so both of these books kind of deal with their content, and so it's not necessarily a chronological order of things, the same, as we might think if we're reading through most books and we're going through history, because really kind of, when you look at the 5 books, for the most part, it does kind of follow a chronology, especially when you think of Genesis and then going into Exodus and all that stuff. So there is a kind of a continuation. But when you get to these books that are dealing with the law and their travels in the wilderness and all that stuff, you're going to find a lot of overlap. And, of course, different history that's given, but you're going to be, as we will end with the book of Numbers and the passing of Moses, because it's at the end of their journey. And so it's now that the torch will be handed off to Joshua. So we won't get to that whole thing tonight. There's still too many chapters, but it is still one of those things when you just go, oh man, if we get to that chapter tonight, it's where God says, you're going to go to this mountain, you're going to look at the land that's going to be inhabited. You're not going in, but you're going to look at it and you're going to die right after, pretty much right after. Kind of like what it was with Aaron. And I find myself reading that. I mean, I know it, but still it's kind of shocking to the senses. Is anybody else kind of like that? All right, good. So it's not just me being weird. All right. Or it may be me being weird and you're just weird like I am. That could be, there's your other alternative. So there's that possibility as well. All right, so we're in chapter 25. And if you've been here over the last, couple of studies through this, you'll know that as we went through and looked at this whole thing with Balaam and this desire of the king of Moab to have God curse the children of Israel through Balaam. And Balaam was just, I can't do what God is not allowing me to do. Now, things are not going to go well for Balaam a little bit later. But what ends up happening, his counsel, though we don't have a real clear record of it, it's only kind of hinted at, but we see the results of it. So chapter 25 is the beginning of somehow Balaam gives counsel. We get that from chapter 31. I'm going to leave that by itself because it really raises a very interesting theological question that comes up. And by the time we get to chapter 31, it is one of those times when we as believers, sometimes we've got to be able to come to the text and say, no matter how you read it, it is troubling to the senses to read what we're reading. Because how God wants to deal with the people of Moab is really brutal. And you can see the reason for it, though, in context from what we see here in chapter 25. And the reason that God did not want his people mingling with any others, here's the great reason for it. Chapter 25 is a good example of it. And so I'll probably allude to it a little bit, but when we get into chapter 31 and what all is said there, it is again very shocking to the system. And yet we want to also remember that this was a time when they're going in to lay hold of the land. And seriously, there was a full court press, if we want to call it that, by the devil to try to find a way to ruin and destroy the children of Israel before they ever got to the place of promise. And so God enacts what we would consider extreme measures, but they are only for a very limited time, and they are always with a very limited people. So how many times have you had conversations with people and somebody would say, oh, you're one of those people that you believe in that God that did all that stuff in the Old Testament, killed entire groups of people and all that stuff. You get that one thrown at you all the time, I'm supposing? If you talk with people, well, they'll use chapters like we have, and yet we want to remember that God never says indiscriminately to go wipe out anyone. And so every time that it was done under war footing. And there was a time when there is a real existential threat to the children of Israel, and so this was the only viable option to preserve the nation. So we'll get there eventually, probably not tonight. And real quick, if you guys don't know where I've been, you're looking at it and said, what's up with all the Band-Aids? This is what happens when you go to Texas and work on your kid's house. You get cuts and bruises and all kinds of stuff. So these are just injuries sustained at my kid's place. All right, so it's not that I'm like totally clumsy. It's 4 days worth of work that caused this. Chapter 25 of the book of Numbers. Let's turn there. And let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you as you gather us in this place tonight that we are able to come to your word. And though we study what is primarily history to us, it also gives us a great understanding of who you are and why you do the things that you do. And looking at the history of your people gives us a good understanding also of how it is that you interact with your creation, those who would call upon your name. Different covenants, and yet a God who is consistent. We thank you for that. We thank you that we are able to study these histories and that we are able to learn. And recognizing that you are not a God who will take a passive look at the matters of sin, but sin has consequence. And as we see here tonight, may we be reminded of that. We give you thanks. We give you all praise. And ask that you would open our understanding to your word tonight. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen? All right. So, again, the whole thing with Balaam and Balak, the king of Moab, kept trying to wipe out the children of Israel. It was done under the guise of his own self-preservation. If it's not this way, if this doesn't happen, we're not going to survive. We've seen what's happened to all the other nations. And so this Balak finds Balaam and says, come and curse them. And so over and over God says, no, go and tell them what I've said, that they're not going to be cursed, but rather they will be blessed. And so Balak gets upset, and there's all the stuff that goes back and forth. Okay, great. That's all seemingly past. So what do we have here is the counsel that was given by Balaam, though we don't have record of it. What we see is the result of it. Now, if you were here the last time when we looked at this, you'll notice that in the New Testament, in two of the churches, one of them by name was talked about participating in the doctrines of Balaam, and that was to commit sexual immorality and to get involved in idolatry. One of them is in Thyatira, mention of Jezebel, and that she had this person who considered herself a prophetess and had enticed the church there at Thyatira to get involved in that same kind of immorality. So the doctrine of Balaam is known as what we see in chapter 25 when it comes to full circle. By chapter 31, which I had mentioned really quick, and I'll just give you the reference if you want to go back and look at it, but it's in verse 16 where we see, look, these women caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against the Lord in the incident at Peor. So the incident at Peor is what we've already looked at, or what we're looking at rather now. Peor is just a geographical area, and so it's known as the place of the cleft, or the place of the gap. So when you see Baal of Peor, Peor is the location. Baal is just kind of a very general term of the Lord. It's basically a number of different people worship their version of this deity known as Baal, and it would be a little different from place to place. But it would obviously have all of the pagan rites and all the rest of it, and sometimes in the sensual sense, that's what's happening here. That's the set for chapter 25. So, chapter 25, verse 1 says, now Israel remained in Acacia Grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. And so this harlotry that's being mentioned here, some have wondered, is this harlotry in the sense as we think of it? Or is it in the spiritual sense that they join themselves to pagan women? That's the problem. Whether it was actually for pay and all the rest of that is incidental. The issue was that these were people who were involved in paganism, and they had enticed through the counsel of Balaam that we just read about in chapter 31, that they began to join themselves to these pagan women. And they invited the people to their sacrifices to their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. That is the main harlotry that's being spoken of here, because they were supposed to be the ones worshiping the God of Scripture who led them out of Israel, and instead they're joining themselves to the pagans that were there in Moab. So Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and hang the offenders before the Lord out in the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. Wow. Now, they knew what they were doing was punishable by death, and yet they did it anyway. Now, again, this was the counsel of Balaam, and so how it was actually said to Balak or to whatever else, look, I can't do what you're asking me to do, but if you want to get God angry, this would be the way to do it. And so there's the enticement that takes place. So Moses said to the judges of Israel, every one of you go and kill his men who were joined to Baal of Peor. Whoever it was that was involved in the idolatry and the pagan worship, kill him. Just kill him. That's pretty heavy stuff. Well, in verse 6, it says, and indeed, one of the children of Israel came and presented to his brethren a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of all of the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And so this weeping was, from all appearances, this was a brokenness in some of the people that were there watching all of this going on, and they realized this is such an offensive thing, and it was a mourning kind of a thing that was taking place, but it was being done openly. And right now there is now a death penalty that has been imposed. God says do this, and as that's all going on, here comes one of the kind of heads of one of the tribes, or one of the leaders, if you will, of a house, and he's coming with a Midianite woman and disappears into a tent. Now, verse 7, now Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, so this is the grandson of Aaron the priest, sees this. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it. He rose up from among the congregation and took a javelin in his hand. He went in after the man of Israel into the tent and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman, through her body. So the plague was stopped among the children of Israel, and those who died in the plague were 24,000. So these were the people that were involved in this. The number is at 24,000. Doesn't take long, does it? And the action of Phinehas, you might think, well, did God tell him to do that? Well, here's God's reply to the whole thing. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the children of Israel, because he was zealous with my zeal among the people, so that I did not consume the children of Israel in my zeal. Therefore say, behold, I give to him my covenant of peace. And it shall be to him and to his descendants after him a covenant of an everlasting priesthood, because he was zealous for God and had made atonement for the children of Israel. What an amazing statement that is. Now, God's not angry because of what would be seen as a violent act or anything else. It's just he saw what was so openly offensive, and he did something to put it to an end. Now, this is where the question gets asked, and like I said, I'm going to probably wait till chapter 31 and that whole section to get to it, but we do get that question asked. Why would God be okay with this? Let's remember that usually those kind of arguments, if you're not familiar with how to answer them, here's one way you can answer the whole thing. When God has these types of things take place, remember he's seeing the eternal, we are seeing the temporal, about the people that would die and all the rest of it. Remember that when it comes to this kind of idolatry and being joined to foreign gods and doing that kind of thing, that will secure for the people an eternity separated from him. The people who are already participating in it are already lost. Would it be better that they are the only ones lost, or that others join them? So would God want it put to an end quickly, so as to mitigate the additional people that would be joined to it? There would be time perhaps for them to continue to walk with the Lord. But when you get into this kind of idolatry, you have brought upon yourself a death sentence. In the very real part of where you're living right here, you're going to be put to death. But in the eternal sense, that you have apostatized or you have walked away from God and joined yourself to other gods, you have bought for yourself an eternity of separation. So it's better to have, in the war times, get the people out of the way, or else you will be consumed as they are being consumed. Now, I know that that's never going to be a satisfactory answer to the people who are really opposed to this, but that is the way that it is answered as why would God have such actions? Notice he's talking about the zeal that I have is for the salvation of the people. And so Phinehas has turned away by doing this what should have never been done in the first place. There's no reason that that man should have been involved with that woman. Well, goes on, verse 14. Now the name of the Israelite who was killed with the Midianite woman was Zimri, the son of Salu, the leader of the father's house among the Simeonites. Now remember, this is put here only for their reasoning. It's only so that they would know. This is their record. So this is the children of Israel. This is to make an example of that. To us, we don't know who these people are. It wouldn't mean to us what it meant to them. So this is still a written record, and this part of the text has a lot of that, these couple of chapters. And so the name of the Midianite woman who was killed was Cosbi, the daughter of Zur, and he was the head of the people of his father's house in Midian. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, harass the Midianites and attack them. Now the harassment that's here is it's go to war with them. That's what's being said here. Go to war with them. Harass the Midianites and attack them, for they have harassed you with their schemes by which they seduced. Excuse me. It's a continuation of this morning. I am so sorry. For they harassed you with their schemes by which they seduced in the matter of Peor, and the matter of Cosbi, the daughter of the leader of Midian, their sister, who was killed on the day of the plague because of Peor. Okay? So here you have now God calling his people to war. Now, what you're going to notice, it's kind of interesting here. This is kind of an addition to what we saw in chapter 1. If you remember in chapter 1, it was, and that was a long time back in their history. Remember, we have fast forwarded through a lot of history. We are almost at the end of the 40 years here, and they're preparing to go in. There was a census taken of the men who could fight in chapter 1. Now here in chapter 26, at the end of it, it is now another census that is being taken. Notice an interesting thing. In chapter 1, it was the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron. Aaron's gone. Now what we have in chapter 26, and it came to pass after the plague that the Lord spoke to Moses and to Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saying, take a census of all the congregation of the children of Israel from 20 years old and above, by their father's house, all who were able to go to war. Now, here's the important part of that. Why take a census? You've already taken one. So much time has gone by. You're going to find out that when they went to spy out the land initially, all of those guys are gone. Remember, he said, you're going to use your kids as the excuse? They're numbering the kids now because all the guys are gone. You'll see that by the end of this chapter. All the people that God said, as for you who used your kids as the excuse, you're going to die in the wilderness. You know the only one that's left? Moses. The rest of those guys are gone. I don't know about you, but I'm just like, this is pretty heavyweight stuff because God said that was the way it was going to go. And it's gone exactly that way. Verse 3, so Moses and Eleazar the priest spoke with them in the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho, saying, take a census of the people from 20 years old and above, just as the Lord commanded Moses and the children of Israel when they came out of the land of Egypt. So this is now the second time through. Now, I'm going to forego the names. What I'll do is go through the tribes and the numbers that are there, and when we look at it, what it was almost 40 years before, how many there were in the first census versus the second is pretty interesting. So in verse 5 it says, Reuben was the firstborn of Israel, and the children of Reuben were, and then you have the names of the families, the prominent heads of the families. These are the families of the Reubenites, and those who were numbered with them were 43,730. And the son of Palu was Eliab. The sons of Eliab were, I said I wasn't going to do the names. There's a reason why I'm doing these. Nemuel, Dathan, and the rest of these guys. Okay, let's just do it that way. These are the representatives of the congregation who contended against Moses and Aaron in the company of Korah when they contended against the Lord. Now notice that there were still some of them left. Korah went down with all the people who were with him, but not the entirety of his home or of his house. And the earth opened up its mouth, verse 10, and swallowed up together with Korah, and the company died. And when the fire devoured 250 men, and they became a sign. Nevertheless, the children of Korah did not die. So in that, what you had was from that tribe there of Reuben, there was the descendants of Korah, and some of them were still alive at that time, but their number was 43,730. Now, verse 12 says, the sons of Simeon, according to their families, were, and then you go down to verse 14, these were the families of the Simeonites. There were 22,200. As far as Gad was concerned, in verse 15, we have the numbers of his families in verse 18, and they were the sons of Gad, according to those who were numbered, 40,500. Verse 19 gives you Judah, and the number of Judah you get in verse 22, and it was 76,500. In Issachar at verse 23, you see at verse 25 that they had 64,300. And then of Zebulun, you have in verse 27, it tells you how many. It was 60,500 of the sons of Joseph. Now Joseph divided his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Remember how that worked out? So at the end of Genesis, there wasn't a tribe of Joseph, but he was given a double portion, so two sons. And that was Manasseh and Ephraim, because one of those tribes was not going to get an allotment of land, remember? And that would be the tribe of Levi. So there would still be 12 tribes, though there were 13 by name, 12 tribes to inhabit the land, and then the Levites did not get an allotment of land, and the other tribes were to support them. Now, verse 28, the sons of Joseph according to their families, Manasseh and Ephraim, they're broken down separately in verse 34. These are the sons of Manasseh, and there were 52,700. And of Ephraim, we are told in verse 37 that there were 32,500 of these men. Now this is 20 years old and above that are able to go to war. So in verse 38 we get Benjamin, and then Benjamin we find out in verse 41, the sons of Benjamin according to their families and those who were numbered with them were 45,600. And then of Dan we get in verse 43, it tells us that there were 64,400. And then verse 44 of Asher, there were, in verse 47 tells us that there were 43,400. Now, as we get to the end of these, Naphtali in verse 48, it tells us that there, in verse 50, that there were 45,400. Why is that all important? Well, the numbers, imagine in 40 years. In the first census, when you added them up, there were 603,550 men that were of fighting age. And that's how we are trying to figure out how many people were actually in the children of Israel. Now, from the ages 20 and above that were able to fight but weren't so old, this doesn't deal with women and children and the older men and older women. That's why some people put the number probably somewhere in the 2 million plus range that moved in the wilderness. And the logistics of that is just amazing. How do you take care of those people? And God provided, obviously, as we know, supernaturally. But think about this. So much of what took place in those 40 years, we have a lot of history. But it is just a drop compared to 40 years of 2 million or so people. Because 40 years later, this census that's taken, it went from 603,550 to 601,730. Only a difference of about 2,000 people. Why didn't their numbers increase? because they kept being judged. You know, they're losing a lot of people from what we knew. And so, interesting, but still, after all that time, wandering in a wilderness and not having a home, your numbers don't really shrink. You would assume if it didn't shrink of those numbers, it probably didn't of the others as well, but for the older people. They had gone, and, you know, that was it. Well, as we go on, verse 57, it says, "Now these are those who were numbered of Levites according to their families." And so it gives you the same numbering of them. And it does mention a little bit about Aaron. It says, "Now the name of Amram's wife," verse 59, "was Jochebed, the daughter of Levi, who was born to Levi in Egypt. And Amram bore Aaron, Moses, and Miriam." And so it gives you the family tree of that. "And to Aaron were born Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar. Nadab and Abihu died when they offered profane fire before the Lord." Remember their history, right? "And those who were numbered of them were 23,000, every male from a month old and above, for they were not numbered among the other children of Israel, because there was no inheritance given to them among the children of Israel." I started thinking about this too, that when you look at the allotment, and when we get to it eventually, when we start to look at, you know, who went to what area, they were still known as Israel, but there would be times when invading armies would come in, and there would be some of the tribes that would get really kind of pummeled much worse than others. Those of you who've been with us to the trips to Israel know that when we're up in the north and you get to Dan, every invading army would want to come through the north. It was just an easier way of doing it, and trying to get an army up there or into Israel coming in from the north was much better. And who is the first one to get beat down? Dan. Dan's probably thinking, why did we get stuck in the north, man? Because what's interesting about it too, though, at the very beginning of Dan's land allotment is the city of Dan, and there is where Jeroboam set up the false idols and the idolatry for the people so that they wouldn't go to Jerusalem. So, I mean, you just look at it and you just think, oh my gosh, it would be a tough thing. Does the whole nation go to war, or is it just the surrounding tribes? It's just kind of an interesting thing to think about. But we know that the tribes were kind of taken out in the north when Assyria came to town, and they were on their way to Jerusalem. It would have taken them all out. But anyway, we'll get to that eventually. Now, in verse 62, or verse 63, there's a very interesting little ending to this chapter. And it says this: "These are those who were numbered by Moses and Eleazar, the priest, who numbered the children of Israel in the plains of Moab, by the Jordan across from the Jericho. But among these there was not a man of those who were numbered by Moses and Aaron the priest, when they numbered the children of Israel in the wilderness of Sinai." That's how we know that there has been a lot of time that has passed. Again, Aaron's gone, and now it is Moses and Eleazar. But Eleazar is going to be around for a while. Moses is on his way out. Verse 65. "So the Lord said of them, they shall surely die in the wilderness, and so there was not left a man of them except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun." Remember, that was exactly what was said would happen. When they came back and they gave the report of the spying out of the land and all the rest of it. So we get then to this allotment of land. This is when you realize that they are genuinely making preparation to go into the land. So it happens very subtly. We don't really recognize it. If you've been here through the whole study of this, we would think, okay, Exodus is done. They're in the land. God's given them the law at Sinai. And so they're just starting to move north. And they've, kind of had some opposition. They've gone through Edom, and they've gone through Ammon. They've gone up into Moab, and they're on their way into the promised land. Everything's going pretty quick. That's how it should have been. That's why we don't have a lot of just the wandering around that took place. But that was for a number of reasons. But at the top of that was, hey, there were people that were alive that God said, I'm not just going to take you all out. You're just going to die out here in the wilderness. because you wouldn't believe that I was willing and able to bring you into the land of the promise. And you used your kids as the excuse. Now here we've just seen them numbered, and here we're told at the end of this chapter, all of those people God said wouldn't go in, didn't go in. They're all gone. Who's left? Moses, Joshua, and Caleb of that age group that was there. Pretty interesting, huh? So all those kids are now grown up. They're able to go in, but there's none left from that original group. These are the older people who were there. Now, chapter 27, then came the daughters of Zelophehad, best I can do. And I'm not going to do a whole lot of the rest of them. So anyway, these are daughters of a guy, and he had no sons. So here these daughters are saying, well, wait, there's no inheritance for us. What then should be done for us? Because our father had no sons. He was judged. He wasn't part of the whole thing with Korah, but he still nonetheless died in his sin. Was that the unbelief of, the spies or whatever it may be? And so it says in verse 2, so they stood before Moses and before Eleazar the priest and before the leaders of all of the congregation in the doorway of the tabernacle of meeting. And they said, our father died in the wilderness, but he was not of the company of those who gathered against the Lord in the company of Korah. But he died of his own sin, and he had no sons. Why should the name of our father be removed from among the family because he had no son? Give us a possession among our father's brothers. And so Moses brought their case before the Lord. Can we stop for just a moment and recognize something here? The access that you see that God gave to Moses and that Moses had with God, that's profound. You shouldn't just dismiss it, but the idea that, let me go inquire of the Lord for you, knowing that he would get an answer. That's pretty cool stuff. So the Lord then spoke to Moses. The daughters speak what is right. They shall surely be given them a possession of inheritance among their father's brothers, and cause the inheritance of their fathers to pass to them. And you will speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a man dies and has no son, then you shall cause, and he dies rather, and has no son, then you shall cause his inheritance to pass to his daughter. And if he has no daughter, then it will be given to his brothers. And if he has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if it goes down the line. The closest person that there is in the way of kinship. Now, it's important that it's not like God goes, well, I never thought of that. I never thought of it. It just never occurred to me. This was one of those kind of things of the inquiring of the Lord. Come to him and ask him. He'll give you detail. So in this case, you also want to think, this goes along the lines of what James says, you have not because you ask not. But at the same time, the caution is, don't ask just because it seems like it's a good thing and because you want stuff. Because God's not in the business of just giving you stuff because you asked. There's more to it than that. And so here they had said, look, this is a right and proper thing. And so God puts this in place, as you see in verse 11. And if his father has no brothers, then you will give his inheritance to his relative closest to him in his family, and he shall possess it. And it shall be to the children of Israel a statute and a judgment, just as the Lord had commanded to Moses. So there it is. From now on, this would be the way of the allotment. And again, this is the land, remember, that was promised all the way at the beginning. This goes back to Abraham. This is the land that I am taking you to. It's going to be inheritance to your people, to your generations after you. Think about how much time has transpired, and here we are now at the cusp. So you have had Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, to the sons of Jacob, to the 400 plus years in Egypt, and now these 40 years thereafter, and now they're finally getting to the place of their inheritance. Again, it is, you hear me mention Israel a lot, and it is because it's not only the place where the Lord did the things that he did, and the New Testament sites that you go to, and going to his hometown and all that stuff, but think about the history that we're reading here. And the places where they went to go inhabit was from top to bottom, and you're able to see something that was that was inhabited by people after a promise given by God that's 3,000 plus years ago that they came into the land. And even the remnants of some of the stuff, even from Abraham's time, it's still there. And it's a place that is still alive and rich with history. It's kind of it's a surreal thing to go and survey it and to be a part of it. Now, with that said, there is something here that will be brought up again when we get to Deuteronomy. There's a bit more detail that's given to us there. And I'm going to point out something to you that is said here to Moses, and because it'll be a while until we get there in the book of Deuteronomy. But one of the places that we get a chance to visit when we're in Israel is Masada. Now, how many of you are familiar with Masada? Okay. When they finally went and excavated it, and they went and looked through all of the ruins, it was still very much, you could tell that there was a dwelling there. And we think of Israel becoming just kind of wiped out in the formal sense because of Titus around 70 AD, right? But Masada kept on for another 2 to 3 years before it was finally captured by Silva and the Roman legions, right? You can still see the remnant of it. You can still see their encampments, the Roman encampments that are 2,000 years old, the fences and the ramparts and all that stuff. It's still there. Even the siege causeway that was built to get up to it, it's still all there. The interesting thing about it, and it's the segment of Deuteronomy's writing, or the writing of Deuteronomy rather, and it's the same as what we're reading here in verse 12 of Numbers. It's the same event where God takes Moses to a mountain and only lets him look in and see it. But he's never able to get to it. And when we get to Masada, one of the interesting things is what they found in the floor underneath the synagogue. And they found remnants of some scrolls. The important part is what was found in them. And what was found in them was the Deuteronomy passage that corresponds to what we have here in Numbers, and that was where Moses was able to look at the land. So of the 2 scrolls that they could find, the one was saying, here's the land that God gives to Israel, and Moses was able to see it. The other one is Ezekiel, and it's the dry bones. And so it is, Moses saw the land, the people went and occupied it, they once again rebelled and were removed from the land, but God would restore them, so Ezekiel in 37, and the dry bones thing. That was found there, and it's only starting at verse 14 where he's able to see the dry bones and then the flesh coming back on him, and it's the prophecy that they'd be restored. That's what was found at Masada. I mean, it's just, you can't make that stuff up. You can't write a script like that. It's just an amazing thing. But it's very similar, the Deuteronomy passage is similar to what you have here at verse 12. So here's that thing I was telling you about, when you're reading something, you go, oh my gosh, we're coming to the end of his life. Verse 12. Now the Lord said to Moses, go up into this mount, Abarim, and see the land which I have given to the children of Israel. And when you see it, you also then will be gathered to your people, as Aaron, your brother, has gathered, or was gathered. That's basically just saying you're going to see it and then you're going to die. That's kind of heartbreaking. For in the wilderness of Zin, during the strife of the congregation, you rebelled against my command to hallow me at the waters before their eyes. These are the waters of Meribah at Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin. So you remember that time when God says, the people were complaining about water, and here's what I want you to go and do. Speak to it. Instead he strikes it, does all that stuff, and water comes out. But God pulls him aside and said, I did not tell you to do that. You in your anger have rebelled against me, and because of that, you're not going in either. Wow. And now here, this is, it's a heavyweight thing. This is basically God saying, this was yours. I called you to take the people into it. Instead, you'll just see it from a distance, but you'll never step foot in it. It is important for us to once again remember when God says something, he does not speak idly. He means what he says. It is important for us to take him at his word and not to tempt him. Moses is a case study in this. So then Moses spoke to the Lord. Now, We don't know the transition of this. Was it like instantaneously that you're going to go and do this? Remember, he hasn't gone there yet. God's just saying you're going to go. Moses' concern that we have recorded in the next thing is, what about the children of Israel? What about them? What about their well-being? Pretty cool. So Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, let the Lord God of spirits of all flesh, set a man over the congregation, who may go out before them and go in before them, who may lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of Israel, or the congregation rather of the Lord, may not be like sheep which have no shepherd. If you remember way back when this whole thing started with Moses and all the rest, and how God will call men to do the things that they do, but he puts the invitation to them knowing that they would have that reply, and he goes to the men and invites them to do something knowing the character of them, even though they're not perfect. We know that he went to Abraham and offered that, knowing that Abraham was willing to go, though Abraham was not perfect. But he believed and he trusted, even trusting in things that made no sense and didn't fit in the real world. You can't have children at that age and expect that to actually work out, you or your wife, right? But they believed eventually, and it all came to pass. Here with Moses, it's the same kind of thing. Why did he have Moses? Why Moses? Well, I think you get a look at the character of this man. Okay, I'm not going to cry and whine about being left. I'm not going to cry and whine that I don't get to lead them in, but somebody's got to. Who's going to see over them? Pretty cool. Neat shepherd's heart. Verse 18. And the Lord said to Moses, take Joshua the son of Nun with you, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him. Now there's the passing. This is going to be done in the recognition before the whole congregation, so that they will know that this is the chosen person that should be there. Now, it's easy to forget. It is kind of hinted at here, but if you've been in our study, if you've been going through our study in the Old Testament, you'll know that there were times when the Lord came and spoke directly to Moses in the tabernacle of meeting much earlier in their history. Remember how it said very passively, very much by the way, that Joshua was actually in the room hearing these same things? He's been there the whole time. We know of him because of how important he was in the spying out of the land. And he's mentioned a little bit, but a careful understanding of this, Joshua is a different guy entirely. And it'll be a lot of fun to go through the book of Joshua, because we'll get a chance to see him in his later years as he's the leader and the challenges that are put before him there. But a very, very interesting and intriguing guy. So when Moses says, so Lord, who's going to lead them? I'm sure he probably knew that it was going to be Joshua. He's been there at times when no one else was. Even at times Aaron wasn't around. And there was Joshua. So very, very interesting. So this is a man in whom is the Spirit. Lay your hand on him. That is the recognition from Moses to him. But it's first and foremost, it's God who is saying, this is a man in who there is a Spirit. Now, do you remember when it was Joshua and Caleb who had settled or gone in and spied out the land? What was it that the Lord said of those two guys? They have a different spirit in them. So though they don't qualify age-wise like the rest of you guys, but because they believed, there's a different spirit in them, they're going to go in while the rest of you guys are going to die of old age or other causes. Interesting. So that is the recognition of you laying your hands on him. This has a very Paul and Timothy kind of a feel to it, doesn't it? Then you set him before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation and inaugurate him there in their sight. So not just you saying to him, but then bring him before all of the people, because somebody is going to have to be seen. And remember, even though it was clear that Moses was the guy, that did not keep people from challenging him. Starting with Aaron and Miriam, remember that? His own brother and sister. Hey, you're taking too much on yourself. Yeah, well, poor Miriam. Didn't work out so well with her, right? Now she was healed and everything else, but leprosy will get your attention. Write that down. Leprosy will get your attention. So in this case, Joshua, this very intriguing young man, now not so young anymore, but this intriguing man is going to be hands on him from Moses, and now Eleazar the priest, who is the representative of Aaron in that whole line. He's going to bring him before the congregation in the sight of Eleazar and the rest of the congregation, and put him in there, inaugurate him in their sight. And you shall give some of your authority to him, that all the congregation of the children of Israel may be obedient. And basically that's as obedient as they have been to you. And think about how many people have been really taken out. The number of the ones that we know, whether it was the one that we just read about or the snakes that were biting them, those were in the 20,000s at a chunk, over and over, of people that died in those offenses. So they've lost an enormous sum of people just because of direct rebellion, let alone just the old age and the rigors of going place to place. Well, in verse 21 it says, "And he will stand before Eleazar the priest, who will inquire before the Lord for him by the judgment of the Urim. And this word shall go out, and the word shall come in, and he and all the children of Israel with him, all the congregation." Notice the transition in this once again. It starts out with Moses, and then your brother Aaron. He's brought into it as well. Here we are at the end of things. Aaron's gone. Aaron has lost two of his sons because of strange fire, which is not doing the priestly duty as they were supposed to. And now Eleazar, his son, has stepped into that position. Now here Moses is going out, and now Joshua. There is a changing of the guard at the very top of these people who are coming out of Egypt, and that whole thing of coming into the land. This is such a transition time. Well, it says now, "So Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua and set him before Eleazar the priest and before the congregation. He laid his hands on him and inaugurated him, just as the Lord commanded by the hand of Moses." So there is, again, this, if you will, this changing of the guard. Now I have, we're going to get back into offerings and all that stuff in chapter 28, and then the order in which they've done. If you guys haven't noticed, I am really having a tough time with voice. This is way earlier than we usually even think of finishing, but my voice is not going to hold up. I can once again blame my grandson for this. It seems like every time I go to take care of stuff at their house, I come back sick. But yeah, well, it's worth it. You're right. It is worth seeing them. What we have in chapter 28, we'll just read a couple of verses into it to give us an idea, because next week we have, next week is communion, and then we'll pick up, we've got probably just a couple weeks left, and then we get into Deuteronomy. We probably have at least 2 more weeks, maybe a third, we'll see. But chapter 28 says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Command the children of Israel, and say to them, My offering, my food for my offerings, made by fire, is a sweet aroma to me. You shall be careful to offer to me in the appointed time." What you see now here is more of the transition. There's the transition of the people. And I find this to be really an important thing. I want to make sure this doesn't sound really morbid. I now realize that I'm getting old. I know, shocker, right? Doing a little bit of manual labor around my kid's house, I have aches and pains in places I didn't even know existed. So I realize that we're not here forever. And I realize that there is a transition of things. It's such an interesting thing, but what you find in that, whether it's the history of Israel or if it's our own lives or anything else, there is one constant, and it is the Lord. One constant thing. I'm so comforted by that. I love knowing that He never changes. And God is able to do these amazing things, and He's able to pass it from generation to generation. Notice what He's done here, because it's a profound thing. He has told Moses, you're going to go up onto a mountain, and you're going to see the land that I'm giving to the people as an inheritance. You can only see it from afar. You won't be going in yourself. But there it is. After you've seen it, that's going to be the end of things. Moses' immediate reply, who's going to take care of the people? It'll be Joshua. Eleazar will pick up where Aaron left off. Joshua will pick up where you left off. Joshua will lead them in. And right here, it's like, don't forget the proper order of things. Here is how you are to present yourself before me. Here are the offerings. Here is the proper order. And he reestablishes that in the transition from leader to leader. Again, I find that to be such a comforting thing to recognize that, when it was Jack, and Jack went to be with the Lord, God was still the same. There was no change in that. There's no problem with that, because God was there before, he'll be there after. And the people will come and go, but he will never change. And I love that as a believer, to say, I am always on sure footing, because he never changes. And it's such a comforting thing when you just read it in the history of a group of people that went through some pretty amazing things. God puts back things into their natural order. There's a lot of change that's going to be taking place in the people, but make sure that everything remains as I've put it in place, because it was intended to outlive you. Do these things. Pretty cool, huh? Now, again, we get together for communion next week. I'm going to cut out here because, again, my voice will not make it through chapter 28. And it is very familiar to us as we've gone through from Leviticus on through, of what the offerings were supposed to be and when they were to be offered and all the rest of that. So that'll be chapters 28 and 29. They are going to come back to dealing with the matter of Midian and all of the stuff that was going to be done in the judgment that happens in chapter 21. We should be able to get through 28 through 30 next time we're together. And then we have a very challenging couple of chapters coming to 31, and we'll go through that and take our time with it. So with that said, I'll have Billy come back up and close us in a song. Let's stand and have a word of prayer. I didn't think my voice was going to give me this much trouble. I thought I was done with it this morning. That's right, you guys have had fires while I was gone. I leave and you burn the place down. Father, we thank you as we come to your word. We are able to be challenged, though we're reading history, and that history is very much different from ours. The way that you dealt with your people was, again, very much different. As you're establishing that work in them, it's just a different time of ours. And yet, we do see that you are consistent. You are the same. You do not change. We thank you for that consistency, and we thank you for the way that it settles our hearts. We ask, Lord, that we would be students of history, that we would have a better understanding of the things here and now. We give you all thanks. We give you praise, and we ask that you would be glorified in our lives, that we would stay close to you in what are to us also very trying times. We ask, Lord, that we would be faithful in all ways before you. We thank you. We give you praise in Jesus' name. Amen.